It is something that we really want to understand because this is a source for research data driven by clinical data itself. So we're going to first hear from Irene. No, I know your last name. I was just making sure because this is on the, it's on the, not quite in the correct order. Irene Koch, the Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York. And you will hear about why she has been invited. Jill Graff, the Vice President of Regulatory at b.well Connected Health, and then David Peloquin, a partner at Ropes and Gray. So let me ask Irene to start this, if you could. And I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time on what a health information exchange is, because I'm not sure everybody knows.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me. With that introduction, you can tell we're sort of, at least I feel, a little bit like an alien who landed in this land of people who do something really different from what I do. Particularly now, but even before that, when I was doing health information exchange, I'm really happy to talk about it. And kind of almost like a historian today for an example of something that happened in New York that I was involved in. So right now, for the last 10 years, I'm Chief Legal Officer at Hospital for Special Surgery, and I have an opportunity to lead the team there, and part of what one person does is research, and we are involved with health information exchange, but really only peripherally. But before I was at HSS, for 10 years, I was involved with the then budding health information exchange infrastructure in New York State, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So that's sort of why I'm here. I could try to explain, what health information exchange is, and I will try to do that. But I remember back in the day, and still, there's that adage, you've seen one HIE and you've seen one HIE, so they're all really different. But I guess just think of this sort of as an object lesson in building one of them in a state and how it evolved and how it sort of went from a regional thing to a statewide thing, and it evolves with changing technology, changing policies, and what that does to the understanding of the participants in it, because I think it is relevant to what we heard about today. What I would say is, from the slide that Stefan showed earlier, it was sort of like the top left corner. It was just the clinical data and data from different hospitals, doctors' offices, nursing homes, social service agencies now, trying to get that together in one place. And he is trying to do it, you guys are doing it for Europe. We were doing it at first in a region of New York State. And I remember as this process went on, a group from Italy came and, was sort of, we were just in awe because there was a national identifier and it made it so much easier. But now, see, things are sort of coming back again, and now you have all of Europe that doesn't have a national group identifier, so this will really maybe be relevant. So what happened was, in New York State, back in about 2005, I was a lawyer at a hospital that was forward-thinking and wanted to work on coordination of care between the hospital and nursing homes and other providers that referred cases to the hospital. And the state, at that point, had a grant program called the Health Efficiency and Affordability Law that was giving out a set of grants, about 25 of them or so, for entities to apply for and put together some infrastructure to beef up their digitization of electronic health records and to share among different entities. And so the hospital that I was working at, where from the legal side, which is where I was doing memorandum of understanding about people who were the different entities that were applying to be part of this grant together in a part of Brooklyn where I was, that was it. We got the grant, and it was scheduled to take off, but no one was really leading it. So I was a little bit ready for something new in my own career, and I said, I'll do it. That happened, and for the next 10 years, I was building and leading, with the technology and the infrastructure, a health information exchange, which I'll tell you really evolved. It was the funnest thing I ever did. It was really creative and interesting, and still is. I'm still on the board of the entity that took that over, so I'm involved tangentially still. So the first thing that we needed to figure out was how we were going to share data between different entities where patients had come to those entities and had their data housed by them, but not allowed to share data across. And how are we going to bake that into the infrastructure? And I can tell you, research was not on anyone's mind at that point in time. It was a small grant. It was about getting data from about 6 entities at that point, all in one place, matching the patients with an electronic master person index so that Jane Doe at one place and Jane Doe at the other could match up, and with their address and their social security number with an algorithm, and then combining the data from the different entities into a consolidated view for treatment purposes. It was really all about the continuity of care and about improving treatment. And I suppose somewhere baked into that was the ability for the state to assess the effectiveness of the grant, but research was not really thought of. And it was all we could do was just to get the infrastructure to share data from 6 entities, match the patients up, and get it on a portal so that people, when they logged in, could see a consolidated view. And we did that, and it was really successful, and it was, fascinating with a very small team. And other grant recipients across the state did the same thing, but in a different way. And then the HIEL grants came with more money, and for a lot of the hospitals, that's how you get this stuff done. And we got 2 more big grants. And at that point in time, about 2006 to 2008, there was a statewide collaboration process that really launched in full force. And that was to get the buy-in, like we've talked about a little bit here today, and the trust of all the representatives of different constituents of folks who were in there who had data that needed to be treated with special care, the HIV population, there were genetics, there was reproductive rights, and how do you get all those people who aren't housing the data but have a say in it to buy into the process? Again, mostly for treating purposes. And the state at that point in time created a statewide entity, like a public-private partnership, to run this statewide collaboration process, and that entity was called the New York eHealth Collaborative, or NICE, but a different NICE than we heard about before. And then it was really how to link these different projects together so that people had common rules of the road for what they were doing in their regions of New York State. So there was upstate, there was the Albany area, there was Long Island, New York City, we still had Brooklyn, and they limited that now. It was like a shrinking number of these health information exchange projects. But that we would all sort of buy into the same concept of how consent should work, and how data security and how the participation agreements between our participants in each of our regional health information exchange hubs would work. So at first, the entities that were regionally established were called Regional Health Information Organizations, or RIOs, and then when the statewide collaboration process happened, they became changed into qualified entities, because now there was this qualification process to be part of the State Health Information Network of New York, which is called the HIE. So there was all these acronyms all over the place, but you guys are used to that in a different world for research. So all the participants in the HIE had to participate in this statewide collaboration process, and I was heavily involved in the privacy group. The different leaders of the different qualified entities. One was a pharmacist, one was a physician, one was a business person. And as a lawyer, I really had a vested interest and knowledge in the consent process. So It took thousands, tens of thousands of man-hours to sort of develop what was baked into everyone's infrastructure then, which ended up being a model for consent for sharing health information data across different entities that kind of turned the consent world on its head from what we knew about in the paper world. So the model was that in New York, in this first instance, and still to this day, the data is uploaded by each of the hospitals, physicians, nursing homes, et cetera, into the regional, the qualified entities infrastructure without patient consent, because that's done under the provision of HIPAA, the privacy law in the United States, that allows an entity to sort of serve as an agent for each separate entity as a business associate. And so the data was already sent to this central entity who was acting as a business associate under these agreements to combine it and to link it, like I talked about before. But then, how do you get the data out? And so the consent didn't come from the patient at the point where you were disclosing it in the first place, because the data was already in there. Instead, we flipped it, and the data was shared when the patient gave consent at the point of access. And that sort of made sense, because a patient, when they presented to one hospital, let's say, could decide in that moment whether they wanted that hospital to be able to pull the aggregated data from the region for that purpose. If you were to have done it the old way, you would have had a patient consenting to disclose information anywhere, like whenever in the future it was needed to be released, and that didn't really make sense from an informed consent perspective. Not that patients are reading these forms when they're coming into a hospital or a provider that carefully, but with education, we thought that that made sense. So that's the model that got baked into the HIE. And the statewide collaboration process in 2008 published its first version of the statewide policies and procedures for privacy, and the word research was mentioned once. And for de-identified data, theoretically, it could be used for research if there was a data use agreement. And I think also if it was approved by an IRB. Again, it was sort of like this afterthought, because it was really built for treatment. Fast forward, and I know I have to do this really quickly, and it's a whole world that happened for the now 15, 16 years after. But now we're on version 4.1 of those policies and procedures. The state has taken a more active role in terms of having a technical infrastructure to link the different qualified entities together in the HIE, so that when a request comes in at one place, you can get data not only from your own qualified entity, but the network of networks, and that's the sort of health information exchange, because there's now a statewide electronic master person index that links each of the different qualified entity nodes into one, and then pulls data when it's needed. But the policies and procedures have really evolved in terms of research over these years, and now recognize a lot of sharing of de-identified data for purposes of that are not competitive with the HIE. So it's not for commercialization, it's not for marketing, it's not for R&D, it's for research, for clinical research. And for de-identified data, there can be users that are outside of the participants of the HIE, but it has to go through each of the qualified entities' policies and procedures. There's sharing of limited data sets under data use agreements as well. And there's sharing of data with consent for identifiable data as part of a clinical research study. There was never that thought in the beginning. It was only consent for treatment, but now there's a whole separate world of consent for sharing. And there's other uses of sharing protected health information for recruitment purposes, subject to appropriate safeguards and agreements, and for inclusion and exclusion criteria, and looking through the data to let people know whether their study design is going to work or not. So there's tons of detail in the policies that are already online in version 4.1, but on top of that, just a month ago, the state published a statewide common participation agreement, which is going to shift the paradigm again. And it gets a little bit more coercive each time as the state has put in more and more money and is linking its Medicaid program to the health information exchanges to help those populations. And now it seems like there's going to be less and less regional control over what participants have to agree to in terms of their own region. It's going to be more of a statewide standard protocol, and research hasn't really been addressed at all in what's being proposed there. They're going to develop standard operating procedures which will incorporate version 4.1 that I just talked about, but will evolve over time and perhaps not give the constituents who I talked about before as much of a say going forward, because it'll be a little bit more state-run. So more to come on that. But I think that it's really interesting to see how the data that was put into these regional areas for one purpose has now shifted, it's used to others, and the norms of how we can do it technically, how things grow over time and how we grow to expect different things with data change how it's used for. And there's a lot of debate, I think, we'll probably get into today about whether that's right or wrong, but that is in fact what's been happening. And so I hope that was a very brief and helpful discussion about one model of health information exchange that happened in New York. And I'm happy to answer questions, presumably later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but that was perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
good.
Thank you. Jill?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jill Graff, and as Barbara said, I'm head of regulatory at b.well Connected Health. So as I pick up from Irene, let me just give a little context about our company so you understand where I'm coming from. b.well Connected Health was founded about 10 years ago, just under 10 years ago, at the forefront of bipartisan legislation that culminated in the 21st Century Cures Act, which, as you know, is a sentinel event for clinical research, precision medicine, but also a sentinel event for a point in time before which we were focusing on the digitization of medical records. And from 21st Century Cures Act forward, a prioritization now on the interoperability of that data on standards. And a lot of the work up to that point was being performed at a state or regional level through these health information exchanges. They were creatures of states, as Irene was expressing in New York. There were also EMR vendors that were beginning to build their own internal networks. There was an effort called the National Health Information Network to try to create something national in scope, and there were nonprofit alternatives that were being, or private options like Commonwealth Health Alliance as a health information network in order to allow permitted HIPAA use cases to drive interoperability of data in standardized formats. And I'm intrigued by the earlier conversation about the EU, where the concepts of public trust are so foundational in trying to develop a system. Trust is certainly foundational in that point in time for interoperability in two key respects. One is, given that there had already been enough maturity for some level of health information exchange, the desire was to actually make it possible for any participant in delivering treatment predominantly to have a single on-ramp to all of the networks rather than having to connect with all of the different, persist more fragmentation. And so we have something called the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement to link networks of networks together, including HIEs. And so I think what's interesting, just as a point of contrast with the European Union, is that with HIPAA, we have established a foundation or a default position of trust. If data is going to be exchanged for treatment, you don't need to have an individual involvement. Usually individuals at the point of care may not be even, it wouldn't be safe necessarily to withhold treatment until you got consent. And so that and other permitted HIPAA purposes, treatment, payment, healthcare operations, doesn't require a consent. There are permitted exceptions to that consent framework. But we have also seen, and the other piece around the 21st Century Cures Act was that data is so valuable, especially in digitized form, that there can be behaviors. Usually it's a business incentivized behavior to withhold the sharing of information even when it's permitted. And so we have a dynamic and a tension in our interoperability world today for making sure that data is flowing where it's required to be done. And so those purposes must be through networks, through standard interoperability infrastructure, treatment, payment, healthcare operations, and the patient right of access. And I think that's the one that I think is really interesting and goes back to Irene's point, which is that patient right of access is very consistent with the concepts around informed consent in the research context. It also is an affirmative right under HIPAA, and it also enables the data to flow for free because it's a patient's own data. And so that being said, it is the moment where we think data, once it flows to the consumer and is under their control and direction, it no longer sits under HIPAA. And so it becomes subject to, if you will, the Wild West of anything that goes under our more general, less prescriptive style of consumer privacy than exists in the GDPR. So we are really living under very different regulatory regimes as we try to navigate and enable consumer participation and consumer transparency and accountability for where that data goes. One thing I'd like to just recenter on for a moment before I turn it over to David is why this matters for you. I know our goal is to get to faster cures. Let's figure out how we can be more innovative, develop more clinical trials, recruit more representative populations to participate in clinical trials. And all of those functions should be made more accessible through greater interoperability and greater permissions. But we are also at an inflection point where there is no priority still, even in that trusted exchange framework and common agreement, for data to flow for permitted, for clinical research purposes. We are still prioritized on treatment. The other permitted uses under HIPAA, like government benefits determination and public health and patient right of access, those have distinct priorities over the secondary uses, including clinical research. And so that doesn't mean it's not moving forward. It actually means business, because that's what we do in the United States. Business finds solutions. And the solutions that we're seeing now are really existing in the private networks that are established by EMR vendors. And they're the ones that are building new products to support the clinical research community. But before you think that's the only way to go, I do want to go back to the idea that consumers can and do have an interest in treatments when they're incentivized to find them. And so there are opportunities under that right of access and through existing interoperability infrastructure to help consumers participate in their own health journey. And as part of that, to even provide value propositions to them based on their own data and based on clinical analysis for them in consumer applications to surface potential clinical trials that may be relevant to them and that allow you to get to the top of the funnel so that you can actually get to more of a broad representation of potential participants in your trials. And I can talk more about that as we keep going in this conversation.
Thank you. David?
Hello, everyone. I'm David Peloquin. I'm a partner at Ropes & Gray here in Boston and focus my practice on advising on, among other things, clinical research issues and data privacy, and have the good fortune of working with a lot of your companies and institutions here today. My exposure to health information exchanges started before I became a lawyer. About 20 years ago, I worked at a company called Epic, which I think many of you are familiar with, which is now maybe the nation's, maybe the world's largest electronic health record provider. And at the time I was about to leave Epic, they would have these big staff meetings every month where the whole company would get together and hear what was new. They were introducing this idea of something called Care Everywhere. And Care Everywhere was an idea of exchanging patients' data between different hospitals. It started in the US at the time, that used the Epic electronic health record to allow a patient that was maybe a patient at Mass General Brigham, that was traveling and maybe they were on vacation in Florida, their provider that they saw in Florida could pull the record from their provider at Mass General Brigham to treat them. And this was really something new at the time and was one of these more private networks like Jill and Irene were alluding to. So fast forward to my life about 10 years later, when I'm a research attorney here at Ropes & Gray, I start getting questions about Care Everywhere from some of my hospital clients that are doing research. And they're thinking about, wouldn't this be cool if we could use Care Everywhere to pull records about patients for research purposes? But when you use Care Everywhere as an institution that uses Epic, you have to agree to something Epic calls rules of the road. You know, they never call things terms of use or like boring names in Epic. There's always some more flashy name with it. So the rules of the road for Epic, one of the things it said is you can only use the data that are pulled from Care Everywhere for treatment purposes. And a lot of my clients took a step back and said, well, that's interesting, because from a HIPAA standpoint, as we've heard, HIPAA permits disclosure of PHI, protected health information, for treatment without a patient's consent or authorization, so that made sense. But these clients were saying, you know, if we get a patient authorization, or if we have an institutional review board that waives the authorization requirement, HIPAA would say we should be able to get those records. But the rules of the road that Epic put out there said, no, we're not giving records for research purposes, even if it would be a permissible pathway for sharing under HIPAA. And so then these clients started to think, well, what might we be able to? Maybe if we pull records for treatment initially, then a secondary use of those might be for research, as long as we have the correct HIPAA permissions. And you know, some people got comfortable that might be a way that we could do things. Another thought people had is, well, what if it's an interventional clinical trial? It's like in oncology, and the trial really is the patient's treatment. Maybe we would make the argument we need the records for treatment in the trial, or if it's an adverse event and the patient went to, let's say, an emergency room at a community hospital, then they come back to our academic medical center for their next visit. We need to follow up on that. Maybe we can pull the records for treatment there. Well, the bottom line is here, there were a lot of workarounds that one had to come up with for some type of use of the data for research purposes. And I give that example just to show that a lot of times I think researchers and institutions get very excited about the promise of HIEs, but then when you start to get into the details, the research uses have not been front and center to date. And so there have been some more obstacles in pulling those data. More recently, we have these exchanges, entities like Care Quality and Interoperability Framework that allows different HIEs and interoperable frameworks to participate in that allow the sharing of data. And I've had a lot of clients in clinical trial recruitment in recent months that have been very excited about some of these frameworks. Oh, could we get data from HIEs to potentially screen against inclusion and exclusion criteria for our trials to identify patients? And maybe we would get patient consent to do that. And then when those clients have moved forward and gotten into some of the details, you know, they've started to see what Jill and Irene have emphasized, that, well, these were really set up for treatment purposes. And when you read the terms and conditions, it's all about you're a treating provider of the patient and you're obtaining the information for a treatment purpose. And the challenge there is when you're doing research recruitment and maybe you're a vendor hired by the sponsor, you're not really in that treatment relationship. And so I've had to have a lot of conversations with clients recently about, you know, this framework doesn't really fit you right now. And what we've heard from some of the entities participating in these interoperability frameworks is, well, maybe next year we will have more exercise of the patient right of access. That's our next priority in some of these frameworks. And then you might be able to use the patient's consent to require or permit the disclosure of information for research recruitment purposes. The last thing I want to note, we were talking about the 21st Century Cures Act here a bit, and one piece of that law that's come up for me a lot in research recruitment and other spaces is what's called the information blocking rule, which some of you might be familiar with, which essentially says if an entity like a healthcare provider that's an actor under the rule has electronic health information, they can't block the sharing of that information if there's no legal impediment in the way of them sharing it. And this has been helpful, I think, for a lot of direct-to-consumer research studies like the NIH All of Us study or some of the private studies that have a similar model, because it means if a patient signs a broad authorization for sharing of their data, the healthcare provider that is asked to disclose data in response to that authorization generally needs to do so. And then that begs the question of, well, how does that work with the terms of the HIEs that are saying this is only for treatment? And I think that's kind of the next level of conversation we're going to get to in the research world. But that's what I see as a research attorney advising clients, a lot of incremental progress, but still a lot of challenges to be solved here.
Do you want to mention for a second Cosmos and you know,
Yeah.
sort of how that's evolving?
So the EHR providers continue to have different means of sharing data, and so Epic has a new model I think some of you may be familiar with called Cosmos that allows for the sharing of limited data sets, the data from which most identifiers have been shed, across different entities that use Epic for research purposes. And they also are making this Cosmos module available to sponsors of clinical trials like pharmaceutical manufacturers to identify which hospitals in the US might be good clinical trial sites for them. So some of the challenges I think that come up there are just making sure that if you're interested in using this product or any other product from other EHR vendors, that you really understand like what type of data are we getting? Is it a limited data set, or how do we link across the different populations in different health centers? There was a discussion of tokenization earlier. That's a key part of this. Like, are the data tokenized? If they are they still considered identifiable from a HIPAA standpoint? That's something really to think about. And then when we get into specialty types of data, like genomic data, how can those be shared because of the higher risks of re-identification?
And how much it costs.
Yes.
Because I think one of the things that we do really well in the United States is that we figure out how to productize things. And whereas the European Union is trying to come up with a bottoms-up approach to establishing and maintaining and preserving public trust, what we have is the data resides in some concentrated fashion by a number of different actors, including Epic as an example. It has like records on 3/4 of the US population. Maybe not the comprehensive set, but at least 3/4 of us are represented in an Epic record. And with that comes an enormous amount of power, and each of the Epic community members, customers, don't necessarily have a say in how that information is now, that they created. Let's remember who creates this data. It's our content creators at the bedside, right? And they're not getting compensated for these use cases. The Care Everywhere treatment use case or restriction is also available so that a new product can be established with a new monetization. And I think we just have to be cognizant that these are the dynamics that are at play as you try to figure out how to access your data and solve, develop your clinical trial and be successful in it, because there are a lot of dollars that then, are demanded. And it also helps explain, cynically, I'll just be cynical for a minute, that's what I do, is we have a lot of lip service paid to empowering consumers and patients in their own data, prioritizing that as a use case because it is an affirmative right under HIPAA, and yet there are persistently a number of policy or technical roadblocks that are presented to discourage the meaningful scalability of interoperability under the patient right of access. The means are there, and they're available, and an example of a technical challenge is we don't have a universal patient identifier in the United States. And so you have fat fingering and you have problems with demographics, and it can look like it's a very complicated problem to solve for matching. I will simply say today, Epic has solved patient matching across its community network, because inside my chart, I can go in and I can select the Link My Accounts feature, and with no more than a check the box, I will be surfaced a number of different other Epic community members that may hold my data. They can't do that without breaching, creating an unauthorized disclosure unless they've got a very high level of confidence that they've got the patient matching problem solved. Turn that around, Epic is a leading network on TEFCA, and it says patient matching is not safe enough for us to run the risk at scale for a mass number of unauthorized disclosures and breaches. If they can do it inside their own network, they can do it for others. And that's my issue with wanting to make sure that we can actually facilitate consumer-directed access. Because if you can activate consumers who are motivated to find treatments and also bring them other value around a longitudinal health record that is not tethered to one portal or one EMR vendor's portal product, then you're able to start thinking about decentralized clinical trials at scale by engaging your patients through a variety of different other applications. I hope that's not too
No, that
abstract.
was very clear.
Okay.
And I think very helpful. A challenge, though, to activate the patient network rather than just, legislating from Epic what's going to happen, right? So I'm interested in the consent issue for a second. And Irene, do people in the HIE consent for every disclosure, or they just consent once to have their data disclosed?
Well, they consent, there's the consent model changed over time to have 2 levels of consent, level 1 and level 2. It used to just be level 1. So level 1 is treatment. And when you consent in that model, originally you consented to have the provider, like I talked about, who you're in front of at that moment, be able to access everything about you that is in your region and now the HIE, right? So it's consenting to that provider having access to everything. And the example that was always given was, do I want my podiatrist to have everything about me? No. So when I'm in front of the podiatrist, I won't necessarily consent, but when I'm in for sort of a general surgery, I will. Right? So that was that. But now there's level 2 consents, which is where research consent would come into play for a research project that needs consent. And so just like anything else, assuming your regional qualified entity or hub would allow it, and that the other hubs that have data also allow it. Right now, that's the way it works. There's a joint committee across the HIE that approves this research, and then the consent for those that don't opt out of it in terms of having their data available for it, then same thing can happen. You get the consent, and then you can pull all the data that happens to be available subject to all that I just said, and you pull it for the study. And that's sort of how it works, but it's only for that one study. And then there isn't consent. So generally, there's a sharing in the HIE is subject to affirmative consent, except when it's de-identified data, which has those other parameters that I talked about, or a limited data set. And there's certain ways that can be shared without consent. I hope that wasn't too confusing.
No, not at all.
And the consent in New York clashes with the national models that we just talked about. So it leaves providers who are the ones that contribute the data regionally, and then they can take part in the HIE in 2 different places. We have data sharing through the HIE, which we just talked about. And then, as a hospital attorney, right, I'm posed with, can we participate in the national projects? And right now, the HIE can't, because the model that I just talked about for so long that I thought was so brilliant, that I was really involved in, doesn't work, because it's the opposite, because the national networks use the different model, whereas a patient, the providers say that they have consent for you to share your data, with anyone, and then you're just done with it. Not for research, right? But for treatment purposes. So New York, the HIE can't participate currently in the national networks. We could get data from it, but we can't give the data because in New York we have special rules about HIV and whatnot, and the policies that I just talked about prohibit that. It's just a different model, and it's not relying only on HIPAA, so it's clashing, and I think that will be another one of the things that is addressed probably pretty soon, because now that it's 20 years later and there is national sharing and stuff like EPIC happening, how can we not be part of that? So I think that will shift over time.
Did you want to comment, Jill?
Well, I was just thinking the only way you make a network work is by having reciprocity. Otherwise, we have a commons problem. And so it's a real challenge when you have a huge populace in New York not able to participate because you don't have the ability to reciprocate. And therefore, you're not in compliance with the network rules.
And we got kicked out.
And you got kicked out,
Yep.
right.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in almost every hospital consent and treatment consent, there is a line. What, 2 minutes? That is so not happening. When you sign a hospital consent or a treatment consent, somewhere on page 7 of 19, there is a line that said your data and biospecimens can be used for education and research. And people call that consent. I call that notification, but it is a consent. And therefore, everybody, for the most part, has already consented, in quotes. Now, I don't believe it, but that is what hospitals rely on to use the data and the biospecimens
Yeah.
that come out of that.
Well, right. So, but the patient signs that for your hospital.
No, I understand.
Right? And
I
so
understand.
now with the network of networks, the original rule had each regional network kind of deciding with its own policy committee whether they would allow that, whether they would allow entities to opt out because they didn't feel comfortable with that, participants, right? Each hospital would have a say. Now it's shifting to be a little bit more mandatory for the de-identified data and limited data set, so shifting.
And can a patient withdraw their data?
No.
Right.
The patient, because like I said before, at least in New York, the data is in there. It's
Yeah.
uploaded as a business associate. And so what they can do is not give consent and withdraw consent and not allow consent for where affirmative consent is required. But for what's called break the glass
Right.
uses where there's an emergency, that entity is allowed to get your data whether you consent or not. If
Yeah.
it's an emergency, and then for certain public health uses and so forth.
And true nationally also? Can they withdraw?
Consent's not relevant.
Yeah, yeah. So, but even if consent's not relevant, they can't withdraw their data, right?
I don't think so.
The problem is that, sorry, with our trust framework, we haven't got it right yet, because there is not enough transparency under HIPAA to understand where data is flowing. That was done by design, the way HIPAA was designed. It was written in 1996.
Yeah.
And then, so there's no obligation to maintain a record of disclosures for legitimate treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. That's true in the networks too. And so what you actually have, if you do things other than classical treatment, is you are creating a lot of dark data flows. And those dark data flows are happening now because people do pull for legitimate treatment purposes, and then for all the other downstream uses that are otherwise permitted with that data, they're doing it. Mm-hmm. And that's actually going to erode trust as more of the populace learns about it.
And given the last 2 weeks, I need to ask, can the government get into this data and use it for what uses it wishes under declared health requirements? And if you think the Supreme Court will resolve that, I just want to know what you're smoking.
Well, I mean, I actually have a different, who knows? I mean,
Yeah.
the interesting thing was that the first Trump administration took a very dim view to national networks or to the existing infrastructure for network-based exchange. Whether or not that similar dismissive nature will regain, who knows? Who knows? But the Biden administration had been pushing it very hard, and I just don't know if the Trump administration will.
And a state such as Texas or Florida, can they get into it and decide they need to know certain information about their participants, their patients?
So the issue is that networks, not with the exception of New York, which is a centralized model, many are federated, and so whatever risks exist, whoever holds the data today, be it Children's Texas Hospital, they're at risk today, right? And there was a HIPAA rule to protect providers and patients. Who knows if that will persist? I mean, they're risks.
Yeah. So we didn't have time for questions. Is there anything burning that, knowing that you're drifting into lunch, I think? Oh, we have another session. We have to wrap. Any final thoughts from you all? Thank you so much. This was great.